All right, folks, well, let's get started. I am pleased to welcome you all here to the Ostrom Research Colloquium. Just a quick note of housekeeping, there's a sign-in sheet over on the corner. Please get your name on the list. We're trying to keep a record of the number of people and who is here. If you're not on our email list, just check it and we'll make sure you are. So David Skarbek is joining us today. He's an associate professor of political science at Brown University. He studies the political economy of institutions and institutional change with a focus on collective action, norms, and ethnic conflict. The current project, which we're going to see pieces of today, explain the operation and informal institutions within prison systems globally. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to David for his 5-minute intro to the project, and then we can open it up for questions.
Yes, thank you so very much. I'm delighted to be here with you today. This paper that I sent along is a chapter in a book project that I'm going to send off to Oxford in early next year. And so I wanted to give a little bit of context about sort of where this is going to sit in a broader argument and a broader set of empirical case studies. The basic question of the book is, why does prison social order vary around the world? Prisons in some sense are all the same. People are taken from society, been charged with, convicted of crimes, and incarcerated amongst other people. They tend to come from disproportionately disadvantaged backgrounds, have less education, less self-control. Nevertheless, despite these similarities, life in prison, the informal institutions or extra-legal institutions, the term that I prefer, varies a lot in prison. And so my question is, why is it that prisoners have a lot of influence in some prisons and sometimes very little? And why is it sometimes very centralized when they organize and sometimes very decentralized? And so this slide gives my basic argument. That question says, do officials provide the governance that prisoners want? And if officials provide the governance that prisoners want, I call these official governance regimes, if they are the primary source of governance for most prisoners. And so in the book, I discuss Nordic prisons. If they don't provide the governance that prisoners want, then I ask, is collective action possible and desirable? It may be that collective action problems prohibit prisoners from working together to provide governance. It may be that they're capable of doing so, but it's not desirable because the cost of producing governance is more than the benefits that it produces. And so in cases like this, I call them minimal governance regimes. And in the book, I examine the prisoner of war era, Civil War era prisoner of war camp at Andersonville, where neither officials nor prisoners provided significant amounts of governance. If collective action is possible and desirable, then I ask, do prisoners face low information and transactions costs? And this is going to determine whether they're highly centralized or decentralized in their collective action. If these costs are low, they rely on decentralized mechanisms. And I describe prisoner-produced governance as either co-governance regimes or self-governance regimes. If prisoners are working openly and explicitly with officials to govern, I call that co-governance. If they are distinct and autonomous, although perhaps functionally overlapping, I call those self-governance regimes. And so in the book, I look at English prisons and women's prisons to look at their decentralized self-governing regimes. And I look at an interesting case of a gay and transgender housing unit in the Los Angeles County Jail, where there's a decentralized mechanisms in collaboration with officials to provide governance. If prisoners don't face low information costs and transactions costs, then they invest in centralized institutions to overcome those costs, much as when we think about Coase or Williamson's choice between markets and firms. So within the book, I look at both co-governance and self-governance centralized mechanisms. In this paper, I look at a Brazilian jail, a short case on the Mexican prison, where I define these as co-governance regimes. And then at the Bolivian example is a case of self-governance. So that's where this chapter sits into the broader set of cases and the broader theoretical argument. And I wrote a book earlier on prison gangs in California. They would fit into this particular category as well. With 1 minute left, I thought I'd just mention that I'm moving on past prisons and doing some work on understanding climate change solutions and thinking about application of design principles. And we're doing some survey experiments comparing elite and citizen preferences for the structure in which climate solutions are proposed. So I'm happy to chat after or at any point if you share interest in climate change too. So I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that he mentioned that to the broader group because I know in some of our research roundtables that topic has come up on a number of occasions. And so anybody that's interested, David does have some space available in his schedule in the afternoon. All right, so without further ado, let me open it up for comments and questions. Who wants to have the first word? Go ahead.
Well, great project. Can you talk a little bit about, so in a sense, when you're looking at these, as I read them, we're in an equilibrium situation. And I guess my question is, how did you get there? How did this, self-governance or co-governance, which is basically what you talked about in the paper today, the left-hand side, how did that emerge in terms of who was setting the rules? And I guess I'm also, to some extent, these things become norms in that people come into a system and these are the rules that they see. It's like driving on the right or left-hand side of the road. But in other cases, they're making the rules. And so, which I would call an institution rather than a norm. And I'm just sort of wondering about the emergence of these, if you could talk about it. And then the last thing that was kind of a puzzle to me was the Brazilian jails. Because I think of jails as where you put people for the short term. And then you pack them away to prisons so and I thought the Brazilian jails were like that too, that they were less serious crimes, not such long sentences and so on. So I was surprised, but fascinated that they too have rules even in a jail, it sounds like. But then it would seem harder to have leaders. Because you would think, oh, the guy's, he's drunk and he's here for 2 nights and then he's out of here. Right. So, yeah.
Great.
What's your thoughts?
So thank you. So these are a combination of really big, tough questions and then detailed questions, and that's what I'm hoping to get here. So where did these institutions come from? How did they emerge? Who's setting it up? Seems to be the first question.
Right.
And it differs in part by case.
Right.
So in some of these examples, there are clear institutional entrepreneurs amongst prisoners who are saying, well, we should do this, we should do this, we should do that. In other cases, prison officials are giving a strong nudge for there to be co-governance. In the case of the gay and transgender housing unit in Los Angeles County Jail, it was initially created after a lawsuit from the ACLU saying that gay and transgender prisoners were systematically being victimized. And so that sort of prompted the creation of this unit, as well as making it policy or quasi-policy for officials to work with them. We don't know some of the histories on all of them, and I think in this chapter in particular, I can't say a lot about where did the order in San Pedro prison first come from. That's, I think, lost to us as observers. A second part of your questions is sort of the difference between following norms and making institutions or enforcing rules. In the case of Latin America, it's clear that there are some prisoners who have distinct roles or responsibilities for curating the rules. So the people who are elected to be housing association leaders, secretaries of the housing area, these are people who it is an explicit and clear role that you enforce the rules and you can propose modifications to the rules. Of course, the largest number of prisoners, large proportion of prisoners entering both the Brazilian jail and the Bolivian prison, don't have any interest or intention of taking on a more proactive role there. So for them, they're encountering a set of rules that they sort of take as given.
Right.
The last is, if I understand the Brazilian jails, there's a lockup is another term that they use. I know you've done work on Brazil, so you may tell me I'm wrong about this and you'd be right, but I believe that that when we use the term jail, it's just as you described, but they describe lockups as being actually that sort of short term, a couple of days. A big human rights argument in Brazil, and we've got a judge here, so he probably knows well, tell me if I'm wrong, is that there's a significant and regular complaints that people are waiting trial in jail for a very, very long time. So even if it's not just there for drunk driving or something for a few days, they may be in that jail for months and years. In fact, at San Pedro prison, about 40% of the prisoners are not convicted of crimes yet, and they'll often spend multiple years waiting to get a court case and to have a charge.
I have two questions. I'm trying to understand the chart. I actually like it a lot, but there's the possibility of a prison revolt, right? If collective action is possible, and I'm not sure where that might fit in. It might be somewhere there under, radically decentralized self-governance, I guess. I don't know. The other question I have is, and maybe this is just because I don't understand the way you're using the terminology, but are not co-governance and self-governance by definition decentralized solutions to the problem?
So, so the first question is about where does prison revolt fit into here? In some sense, it doesn't fit well. So providing governance often requires, but not always, collective action. And prison revolt is a collective action problem, but revolting is not the same collective action problem as providing governance. I guess I would probably, so in that sense, this isn't sort of designed to explain revolt. When I think about centralized versus decentralized institution, I'm looking for characteristics in centralized regimes by things that are like lots of hierarchy, rules and regulations, explicit roles that are not defined by the people who are in them, but who are corporate in their form. Decentralized mechanisms lack those things. They're guided by norms rather than rules, and I think the Ostrom sense where norms don't have an explicit body for monitoring rule violations and punishing them. And so we see a lot of co-governance that is centralized in the case that I discuss in this chapter. But I think that there are also decentralized ones in that, in the case of this gay and transgender unit, the norm amongst prisoners is that you can complain to officials if people are acting badly. And you can go to officials and ask for resources or help if you need those things. In most prison settings, working with officials like that would put you in low standing as a snitch or an informant. So here, they're working collaboratively, and yet in a much more decentralized way than say, the Brazilian jail.
I think reference to rules and norms is characterizing the two branches of the tree. I think that really sets it up beautifully. Thank you.
David, could you just elaborate, clarify a little bit, what do you mean here by low information costs, and even for that matter, low transaction costs in this case? But transaction costs, I can imagine, in terms of self-governance, if you have a system that doesn't want you to have these self-governing institutions, you're going to face high transaction costs.
Right.
But I could imagine other types of transaction costs, but I'm not sure what you mean by low information costs.
Good.
What are the information costs?
Good. So this is something that I've been working with and struggling with to sort of communicate in a clear way, and I haven't quite been able to do so because it's still a little bit unclear up here. What I'm coming from this is that in many of the decentralized prison social orders, having information about who other people are and what their reputation is what facilitates a norm-based extra-legal governance regime. So in England, for example, when people go to prison, they go to prisons that are very near to their home communities, which means that many people from their housing estates are already in the prison. So you don't show up as a stranger, but with a built-in reputation. And so I say that information about who people are and whether they're of good or low standing is easily obtained because of these pre-prison social networks. So that's what I mean by information costs. But that doesn't really capture the difference between decentralized and centralized mechanisms, because it may be that I know exactly who you are, either a great person or a bad person, but it's still costly for us to work together to produce governance of some sort. And so I don't discuss the sort of knowledge of people's reputations in this chapter very much, because that doesn't seem to be the sort of crucial constraint. The constraint is here about marshaling resources, deploying resources, the everyday running of a prison unit. And so those are costs that aren't easily borne individually, that collectively they can produce more efficiently. But it's not just information costs. So there seems to be some overlap. There's some area of non-overlap between the cost of acquiring information and then transactions costs associated with, say, better defining property rights.
So why not just add and high marginal benefits? Because you can think of cases where you have a lot of information and the benefits of collectively getting together, are not high because you're going to get knifed the next day or something like that. And there could be other. I guess that was my first thought: is I don't see benefits in this.
They're hidden in the is collective action desirable.
Okay.
But
that can mean a lot of things.
It could
desirable on whose part?
That is a good point, and given I think costs and benefits, might as well put them. They work pretty good. We might as well put them in front. So it's very helpful. Thank you.
So I often preface my comments by saying I actually don't know anything about this field. This would be a case where that, I can assure you, is absolutely true.
Come on, fess up.
But I'm always interested, since we're an interdisciplinary group, I'm always interested to see what literatures people draw on. And so I want to comment on that a little bit here, and then I actually want to address the group rather than just the author. I was struck as I was reading this, speaking of literature, about Lord of the Flies and the incredible parallels of some of the observations you've made and that novel. And I thought that's quite interesting. More academically, I was struck by the similarities of what you are talking about here and actually Lee's question, where does this come from? And Eleanor Ostrom's comments in Governing the Commons about where does governance come from? What are the circumstances? And I'm wondering whether you've tapped into that literature to look for those parallels. That then leads me to the larger observation and for the community as a whole, which is, I've often said, the purpose of the Ostrom workshop is to if we're studying governance, and we've got governance of data and governance of cybersecurity and governance of natural resources, the only reason to put those all under the same roof is because they feed each other, that the lessons we get out of governance in one area can inform us about governance in another area. And I think this example is just a marvelous one because it's so raw. It's so, there is no governance, now there is governance. Where did it come from? What are the conditions for the kind of governance you get? And so, totally aside from comments that would inform this piece of research, I think it's a great example that can feed other broader questions about governance. And so I encourage you to continue pushing on that. You did, by the way, mention in your comments Williamson, which I found encouraging, but I didn't see it in the paper. And I want to encourage you to also look at, it's a bit self-promoting, but or organizational promotion, right? To look at Ostrom.
Yeah, well, I'm a huge fan of Ostrom, who's the direct inspiration for this, and she gets full billing in chapter 1. The comment on Lord of the Flies is actually interesting because when I was a PhD student, I was flipping through an old volume collected by Gordon Tullock on anarchy, and one of his in the old days of the Public Choice Center, he had collected these discussions of anarchy, and one of them argued that anarchy doesn't work, and here's 2 case studies. One is Lord of the Flies, and the other is Andersonville Prisoner of War Camp. And so I wrote a little paper on that sort of for fun as a grad student, and it always sort of stuck with me. And so I've revisited it here with sort of actually legitimate historical archival research to see how does this particular case adjudicate extra-legal or self-governing communities. And the lessons of governance, I think, that come from studying prisons is in part just the bias of the agent type. So if you look at the self-governance literature by people like Greif or Bernstein or Peter Leeson, bless him, Ed Stringham, it's often taking cases of people who you would think are the most cooperative, people who are very commercially successful, who are wealthy, who are elites, and to find that they can cooperate is interesting and important. This is an opportunity to find the opposite side, the more tough case. And I think it shows us that when they make their lives better, it's not because they're sort of infused with cash. It's about just the importance of how we're ordering social and economic interactions. It is the institutions, and if we can get the institutions right, even with a bad agent type. And so I sort of see this as seeing how far we can push whether these, how cooperative can these things be.
Angie?
First, I agree. So I think this is the perfect paper to get us to all maybe step outside of our common silo that we stand in and think about this in a different way. I want to ask a couple of questions actually, but this is early on in the paper, and I just want to read this sentence and then I want to ask a specific question mark because I think it captures what I'm questioning. As a result, there is a proliferation of extra-legal governance institutions that are created and operated by the prisoners themselves. So I guess my question is, and I don't see it in here, but it's quite possible, I mean, I get that this is a specific chapter out of a much larger work and a lifetime of work. But my question is, so I worked at Angola. I did work in Angola here in the United States. Mm-hmm. So, I was there. So the jokes are coming. Anyway, from a past life. So the interesting part about a structure like that is it sounds very similar to some of the structures you're talking about. They have trustees, and so when I read this, I've been through this. It's scary as hell to be in Angola, by the way, where the prisoners run the prison. But one of the things that Angola is probably best known for is their ability to shed associations that came when the prisoners come in and build this governance structure that really reinforces the trustees' idea. So they reject the gang affiliation or fill in the blank of what prior criminal type enterprise they brought in with them. And I don't think I see that reflected in here, but I could be wrong. And I wonder how that does impact all of this. I would suggest to you the prisoners don't create the structures. Oftentimes they come in with the structures imposed upon them for a lifetime of criminal behavior, and they just transpose it because what the hell else? We might as well copy what we've done before. Here's a whole group of my friends who all share the same associations. And I don't think I see that in here, and I wonder how you would tackle that issue, I guess, and whether or not that's true or not, because I certainly don't know anything about Latin American prisons. Not to worry. But the day is young and the flights are endless. Good times. But anyway, I just wonder how that, because that is astounding when you walk in Angola. There are not, there's just people on horseback and the prisoners run the prison. And they have very clearly done a great job through force and fear and, don't get me wrong, of shedding those prior associations. And it seems to me that is something that would still influence widely the prisoners' structure in these prisons. So is it somewhere? Is it something that you're wanting to do, sort of the econ argument of it's here, but I'm going to ignore it, which is fine as well.
So I mean there's a one of the most predominant perspectives for understanding life in prison is this so-called importation theory.
Right.
And the idea is that they bring in cultures, values,
Right.
perspectives, and recreate them
Sure.
in the prison. So in my
die for failure.
Mhm.
Right. In many ways, they die for the failure to continue to be affiliated with those prior affiliations.
Right.
Um,
And so what I found in the history of California's prison, my sort of last project, was that didn't seem to explain things very well.
Mhm.
And some of the most persuasive evidence to me was that when you look across the country, there were gangs in states that didn't have very serious street gang problems. So there was no one to import gangs into the prisons in the first place, and so that didn't seem to explain sort of cross-country or cross-state comparisons very well. I certainly don't talk very much about it in this chapter, not at all, and I think that's an excellent point. Because of course a prison isn't just a stock of prisoners, there's a flow, entering and leaving.
Right.
And I guess I'm sort of trying to think on my feet in response to your question. I mean, there are lots of situations where I think you have very little choice about whether to import or not. It's sort of so well operated and ingrained that you have to go along with it. But in others, that's sort of less strong. So this isn't fair because I sent you one chapter, not the
Right.
others.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
But again, in the English chapter, there's a lot more flexibility and fluidity. And in fact, that's the looseness is a term that the ethnography study in these places use over and over again. There's a looseness in the social structure in a way that the Latin American case is not loose. It's actually quite rigid. And so the importation or bringing in preferences for what you do or don't want to happen while you're in prison, there's more scope for your autonomy in these loose prisons than in places like this, where it seems that choice is significantly limited. So I guess that your point raises this question, which is that maybe the importation theory matters in some places and not others. And well, why is that and where is that? And I'll have to think more about how to tease that out.
Thank you, David, for coming and offering this presentation about this wonderful region. I do work also in Latin America, and I always keep telling my students this is an area that I would really like to study because there is not much literature actually about prisoners in Latin America. My question is about case selection.
Good.
And whether actually the selection of cases is going to determine the type of self-governance mechanisms that are going to appear. Because the nature of prisoners varies from country to country. Yeah, in Mexico, drug leaders, in Colombia, the same, but also guerrilla groups, for example, in the case of Colombia. So, and I think that the nature of these prisoners actually is going to determine the self-governance mechanisms. And I see that your approach use more and the organizational level. But I wonder how the directors of these prisons actually also influence the type of self-governance mechanisms that are going to emerge. What is the background of these directors? What is the professionalization of these directors? Because one thing that, for example, strikes me is why certain prisons implement vocational training for prisoners while others not. And the fact of having this vocational training is going to change entirely the culture of the prison. So what determines that? So I would like to see more how the background of these directors or even the professionalization of people working in this and how the nature of the prisoners is going to determine that. Because no matter probably how good that they are going to design, if for example in the Colombian case I have heard, well, there are 3 different pavilions. In one they have the guerrilla groups, in another one they have the paramilitary groups, in another one they have the drug leaders. And they can't see each other because otherwise they will kill each other. So that is going to determine the self-governance mechanisms. Indeed, they have one self-governance mechanism for each pavilion.
Yeah, great. So I think you sort of raised at least 3, maybe 4 important points. Thank you for that. So it's certainly clear, so the unit of analysis is essentially the prison social order of a particular prison. And the prisoners at these prisons may vary in important ways that confound or actually explain differences in the social order that we see emerging there. And so that is an absolutely fundamental concern that should be addressed. In the majority of the cases that I study, they are not selected to homogenize the type of prisoner that is there. They are general population prisons. I don't have specific distributions of crimes or sentences and ages and education levels to sort of prove this. But within countries and across countries, I do, in the other chapters, try to sort of justify that these aren't special in that they incarcerate a special type of person. So the unit of analysis is the prison social order. In the book, I look at a total of 15 cases that are selected based on variation in the explanatory variables of my theory, variation in the quality of official governance, and variation in the size, diversity, pre-prison experiences, or pre-prison social networks of the prisoners. They're a convenient sample based on existing qualitative and ethnographic research. So part of my project or goal of this book is to convince prison sociologists, a field that I admire very much, that we can do more than single-site studies, which is 95% or more of what they do, and to actually argue that we can do a comparative institutional analysis of individually conducted single-site ethnographic studies. We can scale these up to learn in a sort of collaborative process. The concern that you're raising about officials is that there may also be not just confounding by prisoner type, but also reverse causality. So I'm sort of writing as if first happens is the change in the quality of governance, second happens is whether prisoners provide extra-legal governance or not. But the obvious reverse causality is that they know at time 1 that there will be extra-legal governance, and so they don't provide quality governance, so it's actually the extra-legal governance determining the official governance. Until I get smarter, I'm sort of punting on how to identify that relationship better. The framework of the book takes as given the quality of official governance, and I make some arguments here and there to try to suggest that that's not the whole story or most of the story. But I don't know enough about penal policy making across these regimes to be able to say that, that's a small part of it or it's a large part of it. So in a sense, the theory takes changes in the quality of official governance as exogenous and given. And that's a limitation.
And I wonder whether also it might be contingent on the level of government, because I would say that the self-governance mechanisms might vary at the national level and the subnational level and in the local level.
I'm not sure I quite understand the comment.
And so maybe given the decentralization process in Latin America, probably in some areas and the capital level or larger cities, it might be different than we happen in middle-level cities and small cities.
So in the 15 cases, I try to find some subnational variation. This is the first chapter that I worked on, and so in some ways it's the least well-developed. The last chapter, I've got a very clear understanding of how I'm going to analyze these things. So part of the reason I wanted to present it here was so we could push on it. So in England, I look at subnational variation in English prisons between maximum security prisons and medium security prisons. In the case of women's prisons, I'm able to look at variation in California based on the size of the women's prison, based on how long the women's prison has been in existence, and whether the women's prison was built. In California, when we build prisons there, we build them so that they would fit certification as men's prisons and higher security, even if they're housing lower security female prisoners, so that if we need to lock up more men, we can put them in there. But the original women's prisons were more cottage style based, and so the architecture of those prisons is very different. And so I'm comparing across these units in California to try to find out, is it one of these other things that's driving it? So the classic problem in comparative politics is many variables, few cases, and that's something I'm trying to negotiate or elude.
So I was kind of struck by the cleanliness and terribleness of these examples in this chapter. So I'm kind of curious about the role of governance for providing public goods. Where does it fit in this framework? In other words, it seems like we're in the centralized mechanisms on the high transaction costs. Is there a difference between that and, like, say, do they provide public goods such as, the cleanliness of the prison and things like that between the decentralized mechanisms and the centralized? Why is the centralized mechanism failing to provide that particular public good? Things like that. In other words, where does this fit in? Because I know in the California book you do talk a lot about how they provide a lot of these
Public goods
type problems.
Yeah, so in the Mexico case, which is just a sort of a very short case indeed, I guess the public good that's in existence there is a market, and in the sense that anyone can participate in the market and there are benefits. So the institutional setting, I guess, may be the public good. In the Brazilian case, the public good is in fact the cleanliness, the order that is happening by the collaboration between prisoners. Maybe there's some public goods in the San Pedro case in that they do things like provide recreational activities, but I'm going down there next year. I'll have a better chance to look into it. But my understanding is that those are often selectively provided and excludable. So they're local public goods for people who live in the community most of the time. So actually, in the place that's sort of most extra legal, the public goods are most selective, or they're the least public goods. They're relying least on that, maybe because they are entirely sort of left on their own to do that. Is that getting at what you're asking?
Sort of. Again, you paint like a very vibrant picture of this is terrible, right? It's
not very good.
So they're not.
This gentleman has some pictures on his phone that will convince you of it.
They're not very good at providing this. Like, why are the mechanisms not doing it? Well, I'm kind of imagining on the right with the decentralized. I don't think it'd be thought of English or California women's prisons as being totally disgusting. Certainly not a place we want to live, but. Right, it seems like it would be relatively better than that. So why does the decentralized kind of have a mechanism for providing these better than the? Because you have examples about how they're sort of doing it, but it seems to be.
So I think that the resource constraint is huge here, and there's just simply so much poverty that even when the collective action mechanisms are really working really nicely, there's just not a lot there. In the case of Andersonville, it was at one point 30,000 guys sitting in a dirt field. So what are you gonna do with that? Yeah. There's nothing to do.
Yeah.
There's no.
Yeah.
So I think that really is the hard constraint in that if there's just some limit to what you can do. So the gains from trade can take us a long way, but if we don't have anything to trade in the first place, you're going to end up with a pretty poor state. Something I don't do in this project is compare prison performance across these cases, which would be very interesting to do, and I think would be important if this is sort of a viable, for other people, research agenda. But there are ways that we try to study prison performance through objective measures of things like assault rates and subjective measures. So how respected do you feel in this prison? How safe and stable do you feel? Does the prison feel calm? And especially in England, these surveys are pretty standardized and pretty reliable. It's unclear if you could apply them in places where officials have very little role, who maybe don't keep track of objective statistics. But that's also something that I don't do in the book.
Yeah, I'm interested in, again, emergence and also discontinuities. So do you see, let me rephrase it, so people come into the system with a hierarchy. You know, there's leaders, there's order, as you said. It's not chaos. And have you found how dependent on that is it the simple hierarchy, and how much it is the individuals who are occupying those nodes in that hierarchy, so that leaders are elected in most cases, you said. In prison, it could be you're elected for life. I mean, you're in life sentence. I mean, what's the turnover? Or if guys leave, is there, just like in the outside world, when gang leaders get killed, there's a fight, typically. So how important is the hierarchical structure, and within that, what's the role of individuals exercising leadership?
So in the Brazil case, both in the jail and my broader reading of the Brazilian prisons literature, is that there is a leadership, and there's a structure that is distinct from the people who carry out those roles.
That's the hierarchy.
The primary, the PCC, one of the big prison gangs in Sao Paulo, they actively, I think they limit leadership roles to 1 year, and they actively encourage people to filter through those. People who have studied this say that it's to build some sort of legitimacy or buy-in, and to discourage concerns that the hierarchy is corrupt. But there's turnover, disruptions, discontinuities that are not disruptive.
Right.
And in the specific Brazilian case that I look at, and the scholar Sasha Dark's work, he continually finds that there are secession strategies. And in fact, I found, to my surprise, that in the prison gang context, there's usually not internal fights, because the hierarchy has already said this person's going to take over, or this is the process that will generate the replacement. So the people in the positions are distinct from the positions, and there's often clearly delineated ways to adjust to being released or getting sick or dying for those people.
So it's a hierarchy. It's the organizational structure, more so than individual leadership, that's really driving this, it seems.
There is certainly a corporate entity that exists in a perpetuity.
I mean, it begs the question, where did this come from?
Right. And so the interesting with the importation stuff is that a lot of the structures that we observe on the street in California and Brazil, we know that they didn't exist until the gangs exported them out to the community. So the structures may look the same as on the outside, but they were created in prison and sent to the street, rather than created on the street and imported into the prison. So I've got a little discussion in the conclusion pushing back against the sociological theories, because they're at some point too vague to be falsifiable, and not perhaps conceptually clear enough to know, well, what does it mean to import something. So if street culture or gang culture on the street is motivated by something that happened in prison 30 years ago, and then an 18-year-old brings it into prison with him, is that exogenous or indigenous? I don't know.
So I think this is a follow-up, and I think, so the decentralized mechanisms, to me, are already subgroups, and I wonder how you've accounted for that. So the English, but you also have women and gay trans. Those are already subgroups that tend to need decentralized mechanisms to protect themselves and support themselves in and otherwise. Just leave it at that. So I wonder how much that's playing into the comparisons, and whether or not, how you flesh that out. I don't know.
There's a selection effect before it gets to the unit of analysis.
So, and the only reason I say that is because when you put it up there that way, you can see it really easily, and so that's just something else to think about. Is there some group that fits better in the decentralized mechanisms that isn't already an identified subgroup just by the nature of their existence?
Right. And so one of the things, like, as a social scientist, that's very interesting about prisons is there's all these explicit selection
Right.
effects.
Right.
They don't take people to prison on random.
Right.
We don't
So
put
I
them in, not usually, we don't
Right.
put them in specific prisons at random either. We've
Right.
got these algorithms for
Right, I was
allocation
gonna
theory
say,
classification.
there's that whole thing, right, where there would be a group, well, women are the obvious example,
Yeah.
but where you would literally be sent to a prison, a particular prison quite possibly because you're gay.
Right.
And openly gay, or,
So
I
I-
worked with sex offenders, so there's your decentralized, I mean, that's perfect. But they're a subgroup who have their own, but they're also segregated, and these individuals in many ways, if they were in a traditional prison setting, would be that segregated group.
Right.
Who you would literally not let in with the general population, or you just wouldn't because they would not survive.
So this is actually comes back to the point earlier about what is the type of prisoner in these
Right.
prisons.
Right,
And
that's what I'm
so there's a
feeding on.
few ways that I try to downplay the concerns that that's the primary driver of the social order that we observe. One is by looking at men's prisons in England and arguing that they've followed not just criminal justice policy in the US, but prison operations policy actually very closely, except for in 2 or 3 main regards. They lock up a lot fewer people.
Mm-hmm.
They lock them up in significantly smaller prisons and a significantly larger number of prisons. Other than that, men going to prison in England, men going to prison in California, it's not obvious that the English men are qualitatively different, unless we think that they're more polite. And
No, I think they're able to assign them to prisons much easier because there are more prisons.
Right.
Because prison actually is a consequence, not a knee-jerk reaction as it is in the United States.
Yep.
And they have more choice amongst the prison that they're sent to, so they segregate through that process.
And so I'm taking the official selection process as my treatment, essentially, and saying, okay, you've treated men who happen to be in England with smaller prisons close to home, and we're not treating men in California who go to, the average size prison in California is 3,500 prisoners, in England it's about 700 prisoners. In the gay and transgender housing unit, I look at differences in the general population of the jail in the gay and transgender unit. It's clear that it's not a random selection into these things.
Right.
It's explicitly
Yeah.
non-random.
And if I recall correctly, it's even strange because because they're asked to self-identify, if I recall correctly, and people do not falsely self-identify, even though in theory they could go to us.
They do actually.
But the numbers are actually pretty low, last I knew.
The
Of people were willing
A
to
survey of the prisoners in this unit, they believe that about 20 to 25% of the prisoners are not actually gay or transgender.
But
So I don't know if that's high or low,
Yeah,
but
fair enough.
um,
In terms of the total population, okay.
Barbara?
Yes, Barbara Cherry, nice to meet you.
Hi.
My question picks up on some points raised by Lee and the earlier points about revolt. Since an important dimension of Ostrom's work is sustainability of governance structures, wouldn't making comparisons to case studies where there have been revolts or violence be important, because then it could help tease out, was it the absence of some pre-existing governance, or was there pre-existing governance but there was they proved it like a phased transition
right.
because of how they handled leadership? And I would think that'd be really interesting, because then you could look at, well, what kinds of formulation of collective action. Is it the absence of it, or is it the fact that, or what attributes about pre-existing governance can all of a sudden be susceptible
Right.
to no longer being sustainable? And that's where, but I don't know this literature, but are
Yeah.
there, I would imagine there would be case studies, would there be about revolt, stuff like that, so juxtaposing them
So there's
would be
definitely
interesting insight, might provide
Yeah.
some interesting insights, and then maybe things to look for,
that's a great
even in the
suggestion.
sustainable ones.
Yeah, that's great. So this forces me to deal with the revolt question, the sustainability issue,
Yeah.
because that seems to be de facto evidence that's not sustainable for some reason.
Yes.
Um,
So you don't know how much was the absence of something versus just sufficient change in conditions.
Right.
Like whether it's turnover within a hierarchy or something
the-
like that, that leads to.
There's a literature
It's
on-
probably going to be multifactorial, of
There's
course, but.
a literature on why prisoners revolt, and I don't remember all the takeaway messages, but it's generally centered around breakdowns of legitimacy in the institution's official governance capacity. It's not accountable, it's not legitimate, and these grievances, build up, and then something sparks and it happens. So maybe it may be useful to go.
What about revolts because of illegitimacy perceived within a prisoner self-governance?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it would be useful.
So it's not
to,
always just the official.
It would be useful
Just
to sort
wonder-
of sample on the dependent variable and just sort of see what's going on in these cases, and say when there's revolt, what's guiding it, and see if that would sort of back out into a more traditional selection of cases. Great, thank you.
I was thinking about the question of the community political structure when Angie was asking about the prevalence of subgroups, and I guess it hadn't bothered me so much because I looked upon this, especially if you have a very large prison where the N is pretty substantial, that you're going to have a plurality of interests that will have particular focused kinds of concerns, as well as sort of a collective interest that spans the entire population in representation and getting access to and enjoyment of collective goods that would be provided by some governing arrangement. And it got me thinking about some of the early work that Terry Moe did. This goes back like 45 years or something on the organization of interest. And he said, gee, why is it that within a particular community there are interests that are represented and others that are frustrated because there just isn't this opportunity to bring them together? And it does get back to the question of information costs, transactions costs, and the economics of collective action. But it is an interesting question whether or not there is something unique about the prison population that makes the way they organize themselves different than the way society as a whole would organize itself. And that may be a totally different question than the one that you're asking in your book, but it's a related question. And I'm just thinking about a way that you might be able to continue along the track you're on and sidestepping that issue a little bit. There might be a way. I'm just not sure what it is yet.
So the question is, do prisoners have their interests represented in a systematically different way than non-prisoners?
Or whether or not their desire for representation is any different. I kind of doubt it. I'm kind of thinking, what is it that,
I guess
men and women are men and women, whether they serve in prison or not. And
So are you getting at the kind of the sociopathic element that's going to make us interact differently?
Yeah, maybe. I don't
Because
know.
universities could provide.
Because our relationship is really but actually it does.
We don't do very well.
It does raise an interesting question. Have you looked at refugee camps? Or have you looked at the literature on refugee camps and governance?
So first, I think I sidestep that by I'm not comparing political representation and prison to, it's within prison comparisons, and so if we think these are sort of the same, then I can get away with that. Before fatigue set in, the idea was to look at more settings of incarceration outside of strictly the criminal element, and so you could write many dissertations on prisoner war camps across the wars. There's tons of historical material there. The refugees are another case where structurally it's the same, but there's a different selection effect, there's different anticipations about how long you will be there, different access to resources. I do know Volha Charnish is a political scientist at MIT. She's doing some work on refugees from the current crisis, and they're going in the camps and interviewing, and so I'm eagerly awaiting what they'll find. So I do sort of see the setting of confinement as there being different shades, and there's variations there that could be very interesting for someone else to work on.
Last
You have to
question.
forgive us for wanting your work to do more than it was designed.
I wish I could deliver.
As a community.
So, a couple of questions, particularly Nick, that got me thinking about. So, what are the products of this self-governance? In particular, I got to thinking about it. Are the products of self-governance, do they look more like non-rival public goods, or do they look more like common pool resources? I mean, one of the differences, at least one of the differences there is, if you go back to gangs or whatever, if you have collective action, like sort of a common pool resource situation, then if it's successful, then you've got greater rents, right? And if those rents are greater, there's more reason for problems. And so it seems like to me, understanding what goods that are being produced through the self-governance could help those types of goods, and to what extent they are, you know, are the public goods, are they the property rights that allow for private goods? I don't know, but it would help in understanding. I guess what I'm partly thinking is maybe it's something about this setting or some of these settings is that there's a lot less to be fighting over, and maybe the provision of public goods is more of an important element that might be outside of a prison system or something like that. But this would go across different types of settings. What are the goods that collective action can produce, and how important are they, and can they, if they're successful, they lead to infighting over the rents to begin? That's right.
So the prisons definitely have an array of conflict over private goods, negotiation over commonly held resources in practice, and public goods. So there will people have conflict over whether this bag of drugs is of the quantity or quality we agreed on. There's a lot of debate over who gets to use the basketball court when 100 guys want to use it.
And the television.
And the television, and the handball court, and the pull-up bar, and I got a picture in San Quentin where the best place to sit in the yard at San Quentin overlooks the San Francisco Bay Area, and it's a gorgeous view. And there's 800 guys literally who want to sit there, and there's room for about 15.
But maybe they're not so important that they want to be the leaders of this group.
Maybe not.
Leadership comes with that, so maybe it's...
And then there's the broadest, I think we might get away with saying, the public good of public order. And so in the different settings, sometimes they're invested in creating public goods, which is this an orderly social and economic environment? And then sometimes it's engagement over private goods, or mostly private goods, within that public order. And in the decentralized cases that I didn't show you, there are lots of instances where it doesn't take too much to produce the public good of order. People sort of have a sense about who should be disrespected, like sex offenders, and sort of what does it take to be like a member in good standing of the community. And that produces a sort of level of stability that works. I'm thinking of the English case in this instance. And in that, people then engage in economic activity that isn't of a public good nature, really.
Great. Well, with that, David, you want to take 1 minute and anything you want to summarize or any closing comments?
This is
The boss.
definitely a lot to work on. I think that the challenge for me is in refining the clarity at which I communicate this, and I need to find a way to limit the scope of what I'm saying so that I can just say that's a good criticism,
Right.
and someone else should write a book about it. Anyway, so you've got lots of things for me to try to do that to now. So thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us.
When my kids thought high school was a prison.
Yeah.
So you can, and last time I was thinking about this stuff on the radio.